The wind, a mournful dirge, clawed at the edges of Elias's cabin, rattling the ill-fitting windowpane he'd meant to fix for 3 winters now. Rain lashed down in near-horizontal sheets, turning the already bleak landscape of stunted pines and grey rock into a watercolor wash of despair. Inside, the only light came from the hesitant flicker of a dying fire in the stone hearth, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed like tortured spirits on the rough-hewn log walls. Elias sat at a crude table, a chipped enamel mug of lukewarm chicory held loosely in a calloused hand. His face, etched with the kind of lines that spoke of hard years and harder memories, was turned towards the meager flames, but his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, saw nothing of their meager warmth. They were fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall, beyond the storm, deep in a past he could neither escape nor fully recall without a fresh stab of an old, cold grief. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, thick and heavy, broken only by the storm's fury and the occasional pop and hiss from the hearth. He was a man carved from the solitude, weathered into the very fabric of this desolate place. His movements were economical, his presence as unobtrusive as a shadow, a ghost in his own life. Years had passed since another human voice had echoed within these walls, years since he'd felt the need for one. The loss of his wife, Sarah, and their boy, Tom, to the fever that swept through the valley a lifetime ago had hollowed him out, leaving behind a shell that went through the motions of survival. He chopped wood, hunted sparingly, tended a small, stubborn garden in the brief summer months. He existed. He did not live. The sudden, sharp rap on the door was so alien, so unexpected, it was like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. Elias didn't startle, his body tensed, a slow coiling of old instinct. His gaze shifted from the fire to the warped planks of the door, water already seeping beneath it in a dark, spreading stain. No one came here. No one knew the path, or if they did, they knew better than to take it. He rose slowly, his chair scraping faintly against the uneven floorboards. Each movement was deliberate, his hand instinctively moving to the hunting knife sheathed at his belt. The wind howled louder, as if trying to warn him, or perhaps to swallow whatever waited on the other side. Another knock, more urgent this time, a desperate thudding that spoke of an urgency bordering on panic. He reached the door, his shadow engulfing it. He didn't call out. He simply listened. A small sound, almost lost in the storm's roar, a whimper, then a shushing. Children. His hand paused on the iron latch. Children. The word was a rusty key turning in a lock he'd thought long seized. He pulled the latch. The door groaned open a few inches, resisting the wind. A woman stood on the threshold, a silhouette against the tumultuous grey of the storm. Rain plastered her dark hair to her skull, streamed down a face pale and drawn with exhaustion. But it was what she held that stopped the breath in his chest. Bundled in a soaked, heavy blanket, clutched tight against her, were 2 small forms. Twins. Their faces, no bigger than his fist, were pale and still, eyes closed. One of them let out a tiny, fretful cry. The woman's voice, when it came, was raw, cracked, barely more than a whisper against the wind's violence. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, dark pools of desperation in the dim light spilling from the cabin. "They ain't yours," she said, her breath misting in the cold air, each word a monumental effort. "But they need you." Elias stared, his mind a sudden, barren landscape. The rain dripped from the brim of an unseen hat he no longer wore, a phantom sensation. The woman swayed, her strength visibly ebbing. The bundled children in her arms seemed to weigh more than mere flesh and bone, they carried the gravity of a world undone. He didn't speak. Words were stones in his throat. His hand, still on the door, could have pushed it shut, could have consigned them back to the storm that seemed their only companion. It would have been easy. It would have been consistent with the man he had become. But the sight of those small, still faces, the utter vulnerability in the woman's gaze, stirred something dormant, something he'd thought long dead and buried with Sarah and Tom. It was an ache, faint at first, then sharper, a pinprick of unwelcome light in his self-imposed darkness. He stepped back, pulling the door wider. It was not an invitation, merely an absence of refusal. The wind surged into the cabin, carrying with it the scent of wet earth, pine needles, and the raw, metallic tang of fear. The woman stumbled across the threshold, her legs threatening to buckle. Elias caught her arm, his touch rough, impersonal, steadying her. She leaned heavily against him for a moment, a dead weight, then straightened, clutching the twins tighter as if fearing he might snatch them away. He released her and closed the door, the latch falling into place with a dull thud that seemed to seal them all inside, cocooned in the storm's embrace. The sudden abatement of the wind's roar made the cabin preternaturally quiet, amplifying the sound of the woman's ragged breathing and the crackle of the fire. He gestured vaguely towards the hearth. "Fire," he said, his voice gravelly from disuse. It was the first word he'd spoken to another soul in years. The woman didn't respond, her attention fixed on the twins. One of them, a boy by the look of his tiny, scrunched face, began to fuss, a weak, mewling cry. She rocked him gently, her lips moving in a silent shush. Elias watched them, his expression unreadable. He saw the mud caked on her worn boots, the tear in her sleeve, the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of countless sleepless nights. He saw the primal fear that still clung to her, a wild animal cornered. He turned away and added a few small logs to the dying embers. Flames licked up, casting a warmer, more stable light. He didn't have much. A few blankets, stored in an old wooden chest. He pulled one out, old and patched but clean, smelling faintly of wood smoke and disuse. He held it out to her. She looked at it, then at him, suspicion warring with desperate need in her eyes. Finally, she nodded, a jerky movement of her head. He laid the blanket on the floor near the fire, a distance from his own worn pallet on the other side of the room. She sank down onto it, her movement stiff, exhausted. Carefully, she began to unwrap the sodden outer blanket from the twins, revealing two small bodies swaddled in layers of thin, damp cloth. They were tiny, their skin mottled with cold. He went to the shelf where he kept his meager supplies. A tin of condensed milk, rarely touched. Some dried meat. Hardtack. He found two chipped enamel bowls, relics of another life, and a battered saucepan. The simple domesticity of the actions felt alien, a pantomime of a life he no longer recognized. Days bled into one another, marked by the rhythm of the lingering storm outside and the quiet, tense existence within the cabin. Elias said little, Lena even less. Her name, he'd learned it the second morning, offered hesitantly when he'd set down a bowl of thin gruel beside her. He hadn't offered his own. She didn't ask. The twins, a boy and a girl she called Sam and Lily, were the focal point of their strange, constricted world. They slept, they cried with a surprising strength for such small creatures, they fed. Lena tended to them with a fierce, exhausted devotion, her movements economical, her face a mask of weariness and worry. Elias watched. He watched her measure out the last of her own meager supply of dried milk, her lips tight. He watched her tear strips from her own petticoat to make cleaner swaddling when their clothes grew too soiled. He saw the desperation in her eyes when Lily developed a cough, a dry, rasping sound that echoed too loudly in the small space. He said nothing, but the next morning, he left a small bundle of dried coltsfoot and horehound by the hearth, herbs his grandmother had used for coughs. Lena found them, her eyes flicking to him, then away. She brewed a weak tea, coaxing a few drops between Lily's pale lips. He felt her gaze on him sometimes, questioning, wary. He offered no reassurance, no answers. He chopped wood, his axe strokes precise and powerful, the rhythmic thud a steady counterpoint to the twins' fretful cries. He checked his snares, returning with a lean rabbit one afternoon, the sight of which brought a flicker of something unreadable to Lena's face. He skinned and dressed it with practiced efficiency, adding it to the pot with wild onions he dug from beneath the melting snow. The smell of stew, thin as it was, filled the cabin, a scent of fragile domesticity. He saw her mend a tear in Sam's tiny garment with a needle she produced from a small pouch, her fingers surprisingly nimble despite their trembling. She was resilient, he'd give her that. She didn't complain, didn't beg. She simply endured, her focus unwavering on the two small lives in her charge. One afternoon, while Lena was briefly asleep, slumped against the wall with exhaustion, Sam began to whimper. Elias, mending a strap on his snowshoes, hesitated. The sound was insistent, grating. He looked at Lena, her face slack with fatigue, and then at the tiny, red-faced infant. He rose, his joints stiff, and walked over. Sam's eyes were screwed shut, his tiny fists flailing. Awkwardly, Elias reached out a calloused finger and gently stroked the baby's cheek. The crying paused, then resumed, but softer. He picked up a small, weathered wooden bird from the mantelpiece, a toy Tom had cherished, its paint faded, one wing chipped. He dangled it clumsily in front of Sam. The baby's unfocused eye seemed to fix on it for a moment. A tiny hand reached out, uncoordinated, and brushed against the wood. The whimpering subsided into a soft gurgle. Elias stood there, holding the bird, a strange tightness in his chest. He felt like an intruder in his own memory, a trespasser on sacred ground. Lena stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She saw him with the bird, with Sam, and a complex emotion crossed her face, fear, surprise, perhaps something else. He pulled his hand back as if burned, placing the bird quickly back on the mantel. He retreated to his side of the cabin without a word, the silence stretching taut between them once more. The storm finally broke, replaced by a weak, watery sun that did little to dispel the chill. The world outside was a mess of mud and melting snow, the air sharp and clean. Inside the cabin, a fragile routine had taken root. Lena, seeing his supply of firewood dwindling, began to gather fallen branches from near the cabin, stacking them neatly by the door. She didn't ask, she simply did it, her movements still marked by a deep weariness, but with a nascent resolve. Elias watched her, his expression unreadable. He'd expected, he wasn't sure what he'd expected. Tears, please, perhaps a demand for help he wasn't sure he could, or would, provide. Instead, there was this quiet industry, this stubborn refusal to be a mere burden. He found himself leaving a slightly larger portion of food for her, a thicker slice of the smoked fish he'd caught in the newly thawed creek. He told himself it was for the twins, that a nursing mother needed sustenance. He did not examine the thought further. One morning, he was splitting logs, the axe rising and falling with a familiar rhythm. Lena approached, hesitant, the twins bundled asleep inside on the rough blanket. Can I help?" she asked, her voice still soft, uncertain. He paused, axe mid-swing, and looked at her. She was thin, too thin, but there was a strength in her stance he hadn't noticed before. He considered her for a long moment. "You know how to use an axe?" His voice was rusty, unaccustomed to conversation. She shook her head. "No. But I can learn. I can haul, stack," he grunted, a non-committal sound, and resumed his work. After a few more swings, he set the axe down and picked up a smaller hatchet. He selected a piece of wood, not too thick. Watched he showed her how to brace it, how to aim, the follow-through. His instruction was minimal, purely functional. She listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. He handed her the hatchet. Her first few swings were clumsy, awkward, missing the mark or bouncing off. He didn't mock, didn't correct overtly, just watched. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to get the feel of it. A small pile of kindling grew at her feet. There was a flush on her cheeks, whether from exertion or a small spark of pride, he couldn't tell. Later that day, as the light began to fade, casting long shadows across the muddy clearing, she spoke again, her voice low. They were inside, the fire casting a warm glow. The twins were quiet. "He'll come looking," it wasn't a question. Elias continued to mend a snare line, his fingers deft. He didn't look up. "Who?" Marcus, the name was a stone dropped into a still pond. He thinks he owns me." "Owns them?" Her voice trembled slightly, but she controlled it. "He won't stop." Elias tested the repaired snare, pulling it taut. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire. He thought of the woman's haunted eyes, the desperation that clung to her like the scent of the storm. He thought of the small, vulnerable lives now sheltered under his roof. "This place is hard to find," he said finally, his voice flat. It wasn't reassurance, merely a statement of fact. but Lena seemed to draw a sliver of comfort from it. She nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. The unspoken hung heavy in the air, hard to find, but not impossible. The presence of the twins was a constant, subtle pressure, eroding the walls he had built around his heart. Lily, with her surprisingly strong grip, would sometimes grasp his finger when he passed by, her wide, innocent eyes staring up at him. Sam, quiet and observant, would watch him with an unnerving intensity, as if trying to decipher the secrets hidden behind his grim facade. He found himself leaving Tom's old wooden bird where they could see it. He told himself it was just an object. A fragile piece settled over the cabin, as tenuous as the early spring sun. Elias found himself anticipating the small sounds that now defined his days, Lily's gurgling laugh when Lena tickled her, Sam's contented sigh as he drifted to sleep, the soft murmur of Lena's voice as she sang a wordless lullaby. He even began to differentiate their cries. He taught Lena how to set simple snares, not too far from the cabin, his instructions brief, practical. She was a quick study, her hands, though roughened, surprisingly adept. He watched her check them one morning, her brow furrowed in concentration as she carefully rebaited one that had been sprung by a squirrel. A small smile touched her lips when she found a plump snowshoe hare in another. It was a fleeting expression, quickly suppressed, but he saw it. The cabin felt different, no longer just a shell for his solitude, but a shared space, however temporary, however fraught with unspoken tensions. One evening, the air was particularly cold. The fire had burned low. Elias was oiling his rifle, a ritualistic act of maintenance. Lena sat hunched near the hearth, trying to coax a little more warmth for the twins, who were restless. Lily coughed again, that dry, hacking sound that always sent a chill down Elias's spine. Suddenly, a log shifted in the hearth, sending a shower of sparks onto the edge of the blanket where Sam lay. Before Lena could react, before the sparks could ignite the dry wool, Elias moved. He was across the small room in 2 strides, his hand batting away the glowing embers, another shielding Sam's exposed face. A spark landed on the back of his hand, searing his skin. He barely registered the pain. He checked Sam, who had started to wail, more from surprise than injury. Lena was at his side, her face pale. "Is he?" "Fine," Elias grunted, examining the blanket. "Just a few scorched spots." He looked at his hand. An angry red mark was already blistering. Lena reached out, her fingers brushing his arm. "You're hurt." He pulled his hand back, uncomfortable with the contact, with the concern in her voice. "It's nothing." But later, after the twins were settled and the cabin was quiet, she approached him. She carried a small tin he hadn't seen before. "My mother used to make this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For burns." Willow bark and comfrey. He hesitated, then reluctantly extended his hand. Her touch was surprisingly gentle as she applied the cool salve. "His name is Marcus Thorne," she said suddenly, her voice flat, devoid of emotion, as if reciting a lesson learned by rote. "He was my husband's partner. Before my husband died." Or, before Marcus made sure he died. Elias remained still, his gaze fixed on her hands as they worked. "He believes a wife, children, their property. To be owned. Controlled. He found out about the twins. Said they were his blood, his legacy. Said I owed him." She swallowed hard. "He's not a man who takes no for an answer. He has men. Cruel men." She finished tending his hand, her touch lingering for a moment before she pulled away. "He'll track us. He always finds what he thinks is his." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken fear. Outside, a wolf howled, a long, mournful cry that seemed to echo the desolation in her voice and stir a cold dread in Elias's own heart. He looked at the rifle, gleaming dully in the firelight. It wasn't just an oiled piece of metal anymore. It was a promise. The fragile piece shattered like thin ice under a heavy boot. Elias found it first, a week later, on a trap line further from the cabin than he usually ventured. A discarded cheroot, half-smoked, the brand unfamiliar, carelessly dropped beside a freshly broken branch. Not local. And recent. His blood ran cold. He circled the area, his senses hyper-alert, reading the disturbed earth, the faint scuff marks of boots not his own. 2 men, he guessed, maybe 3, moving with purpose, not just wandering. He erased his own tracks as best he could on his way back, his mind racing. He didn't run, but his pace was urgent, the usual calm of the wilderness replaced by a prickling awareness of unseen eyes. When he reached the clearing, he saw Lena outside, hanging small garments to dry on a line strung between 2 young pines. The domesticity of the scene, Sam and Lily gurgling softly in a makeshift cradle nearby, struck him with a sudden, fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. He approached her, his face grim. She saw it immediately, the color draining from her own. "What is it?" she whispered, her hand flying to her throat. He didn't waste words. "Riders. Not far." Found sign. Her eyes widened in terror, a hunted look returning, erasing the small measure of peace she had found. "Marcus," she breathed, the name a curse. "It has to be." Elias nodded curtly. "Go inside. Keep the children quiet. Bar the door. Stay away from the window." His voice was clipped, authoritative. The laconic recluse was gone, replaced by a man of grim purpose. Lena didn't question him. She snatched up the twins, her movement swift despite her fear, and hurried into the cabin. The heavy bar thudded into place. Elias scanned the tree line, his gaze sweeping the dense undergrowth. The cabin was situated in a small, defensible clearing, a slight rise giving him an advantage, but it was still vulnerable. He went to the woodpile, ostensibly to gather more fuel, but his eyes were constantly moving, assessing angles, cover, potential lines of fire. He brought in extra wood, more water from the creek. His old skills, honed by a past he rarely allowed himself to remember, a past involving more than just trapping and solitude, surfaced with a grim familiarity. He checked his rifle again, the action smooth and well-oiled. He had a box of cartridges, not many, but enough if he made each shot count. He found his old hunting knife, the one he rarely used anymore, its edge still razor-sharp. He slipped it into his boot. He thought of Sarah and Tom, of the fever he'd been powerless to fight. This was different. This was a threat he could meet, a violence he understood. He would not be powerless again. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised purples and grays, he moved around the exterior of the cabin, making small, almost imperceptible changes. A branch moved here to create a clearer sightline, a pile of rocks shifted there to offer better cover. He was a shadow moving in the fading light, his actions precise, economical. The man who had opened his door to a desperate woman and her children was now preparing to defend them, to become a wall between them and the brutality that hunted them. The solitude he had cultivated for so long had been breached, and in its place, a reluctant, dangerous purpose had taken root. The night passed in a state of high alert. Elias didn't sleep. He sat in the darkened cabin, his back to the wall, rifle across his knees, listening. Every creak of the cooling timbers, every rustle of leaves in the night breeze, was magnified, analyzed. Lena, huddled with the twins by the cold hearth, watched him, her fear a palpable presence in the room. The first light of dawn was a pale, reluctant smear across the eastern sky when he heard it, the distant, unmistakable sound of horses, moving cautiously. He motioned for Lena to stay down, to keep the children absolutely silent. He moved to the small, shuttered window, easing it open a fraction of an inch. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, dark silhouettes against the growing light. One was larger than the others, riding with an air of arrogant authority. Marcus. Even from this distance, Elias could feel the man's predatory nature. The other 2 were Lena, harder looking, their eyes constantly scanning, weapons held ready. They reined in at the edge of the clearing, surveying the cabin. Marcus Thorne had a brutal, handsome face, now visible in the strengthening light, marred by a sneer of contempt as he looked at the humble dwelling. He said something to his men, and one of them dismounted, starting towards the cabin, rifle held casually but ready. Elias shifted his position, the rough wood of the windowsill pressing into his arm. He could take the man out now, a clean shot. But that would bring the other 2 down on them in a rush. He needed to control the engagement, to make them come to him on his terms. The man reached the door and pounded on it with the butt of his rifle. "Lena! I know you're in there. Marcus is here for what's his. Come out now, and it'll be easier on you." And the brat's his voice was coarse, confident. Inside, Lena stifled a sob, pressing her face into the blankets beside the twins. Elias's jaw tightened. He remained silent, motionless. The man at the door kicked it impatiently. "Don't make this hard, woman." Marcus called out from the edge of the clearing, his voice carrying an unmistakable threat. "My patience is thin. Send her out, whoever you are in there, or we burn this hovel to the ground with all of you inside." Elias took a slow, steadying breath. He had to draw Marcus in, separate him if possible. He called out, his voice calm, measured, surprisingly loud. "She's not going anywhere. And these aren't your children." A beat of silence. Then Marcus laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Is that right? Found yourself a protector, have you, Lena? Some broken-down trapper playing hero? He can't save you." He spurred his horse forward a few paces, the other rider flanking him. "Last chance. Send them out." Elias didn't answer. He waited. The tension was a physical thing, coiling in his gut. He could smell the damp earth, the pine, the faint, acrid scent of horses and unwashed men. He saw Marcus exchange a look with his remaining mounted man. Then, with a nod from Marcus, both dismounted, leaving their horses loosely tied. They began to advance on the cabin, spreading out slightly, their rifles ready. This was it. The moment he'd been preparing for. He was outnumbered, but this was his ground. He knew every inch of it, every shadow, every sound. They were coming into his world, a world where he was no longer just a grieving recluse, but something far more dangerous. The protector. The first man, the one who had kicked the door, reached it again, peering at the shuttered window. Elias was a blur of motion. He swung the heavy bar from the door, unlatching it silently, and burst out, not with a shout, but with a low, animalistic growl. He brought the heavy bar down in a brutal arc on the man's exposed head as he turned, startled. The sound was a sickening thud. The man crumpled without a sound, his rifle clattering on the packed earth. Before the other two could fully react, Elias was moving, using the fallen man as momentary cover. Marcus cursed, raising his rifle, but Elias was already low, scrambling towards the woodpile. A shot cracked past his head, splintering wood from the cabin wall. The second henchman, younger, quicker, charged forward, firing wildly. Elias rolled behind the woodpile, bullets thudding into the stacked logs. He came up, his own rifle steady, and fired once. The younger man cried out, clutching his leg, and stumbled, falling hard. He tried to raise his rifle again, but Elias was already sighting. A second shot, precise, final. The man went still. 2 down. Marcus was now alone, but he was canny, using the corner of the cabin for cover, firing methodically. Elias knew he couldn't stay pinned behind the woodpile. He needed to draw Marcus into the open, or closer. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Inside, Lena was making small, whimpering sounds, trying to soothe the now crying twins. Elias took a breath. "Thorn," he yelled. "It's just you and me now. You want them? Come and try to take them." Marcus didn't answer, but a shot ricocheted off a log near Elias's head. "Fine." Elias scanned his surroundings. The creek lay 30 yards to his left, its bank offering some cover. He had to move. He waited for Marcus's next shot, and as the report echoed, he broke from behind the woodpile, sprinting low towards the creek. Marcus fired, the bullet kicking up dirt at Elias's heels. Elias dived, rolling down the muddy bank, feeling a searing pain in his left shoulder as a slug grazed him. He ignored it, scrambling into the shallow water, using the overhang of the bank for cover. He could hear Marcus moving, trying to get a better angle. The hunter was now the hunted. Elias pressed himself against the cold, damp earth. He could see Marcus's boots as he cautiously approached the edge of the bank above. Elias held his breath. When Marcus leaned over, peering down, rifle ready, Elias exploded upwards. He didn't use his rifle. It was too close. He drove his shoulder into Marcus's midsection, sending them both tumbling down the bank into the shallow, icy water of the creek. Marcus was strong, wiry, fighting with a desperate fury, but Elias had the cold rage of a man with nothing left to lose, and now, something precious to protect. They wrestled in the mud and water, fists flying, grunts of exertion tearing from their throats. Marcus's fingers clawed at Elias's eyes. Elias slammed Marcus's head against a submerged rock. Marcus's grip loosened for a fraction of a second. Elias seized the moment, drawing the hunting knife from his boot. The polished steel glinted dully in the grey morning light. Marcus saw it, his eyes widening in primal fear, his arrogance replaced by a desperate struggle for survival. He thrashed, trying to escape, but Elias's grip was like iron. The fight was brutal, elemental, stripped of any pretense of civility. It was kill or be killed. Elias plunged the knife home, once, twice, with grim precision. Marcus arched, a choked gasp escaping his lips, his eyes fixed on Elias's face in a rictus of disbelief and sudden, stark terror. Then the fight went out of him. His body went limp, a dead weight in Elias's arms. Elias held him for a moment, the icy water swirling around them, red slowly staining the clear creek. Then he let Marcus Thorne's body slump into the current, which carried it a few feet downstream before it snagged on a fallen branch. Elias pushed himself up, gasping for breath, his body aching, the wound in his shoulder throbbing fiercely. He was covered in mud, blood, his own and Marcus's. He stood there for a long moment, the cold water washing around his boots, the silence of the clearing profound after the sudden violence. The only sounds were his own ragged breathing and the distant, terrified crying of the twins from within the cabin. He looked at his hands, stained and shaking. He had killed again. The thought brought no triumph, only a vast, hollow weariness. He retrieved his rifle from where it had fallen on the bank, then slowly, painfully, climbed back up to the clearing. The bodies of Marcus's men lay where they had fallen, grotesque punctuation marks to the morning's brutality. He didn't look at them for long. His gaze was fixed on the cabin door. Lena. The children. He limped towards it, each step an effort. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a deep bone ache and the burning pain in his shoulder. He reached the door and leaned against the frame, suddenly exhausted. He didn't knock. He couldn't. Lena, he called, his voice hoarse. It's over. There was a long pause, then the sound of the bar being drawn back. The door creaked open, and Lena stood there, her face ashen, eyes wide and haunted. She clutched Sam and Lily, one in each arm, their small faces tear-streaked and frightened. Her gaze took in his disheveled state, the blood, the mud, the grim set of his jaw. Her eyes flicked past him to the still forms in the clearing, then back to his face. No words were spoken. None were needed. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter the fragile sanctuary of the cabin. He stumbled in, the rifle slipping from his numb fingers, and sank onto the nearest stool, his head dropping into his hands. The violence was done. The threat was gone. But the silence that descended was heavier than any before, filled with the ghosts of what had happened, and the uncertain dawn of what was to come. Lena gently placed the twins on their blanket, then turned to him, her expression a mixture of fear, relief, and something else, something akin to awe. She found a strip of clean cloth and dipped it in the water bucket. Wordlessly, she began to clean the wound on his shoulder. Her touch was gentle, hesitant, but firm. He flinched, but allowed her to tend to him. In the quiet intimacy of that shared act, something shifted. The raw edges of their forced proximity began to soften, replaced by the unspoken bond of shared trauma and shared survival. Weeks passed. The harshness of early spring mellowed into a tentative green. The snow receded completely, revealing the damp earth beneath, eager for sun. The bodies of Marcus Thorne and his men were long gone, dragged deep into the woods and buried in unmarked graves, a grim secret shared between Elias, Lena, and the silent forest. The cabin, once a bastion of Elias's solitary grief, slowly transformed. The oppressive silence was still present at times, but it was different now, punctuated by the small, ordinary sounds of life, the gurgle of a contented baby, the soft hum of Lena's voice as she sang a lullaby, the rhythmic scrape of Elias's knife as he carved. He'd found a block of seasoned pine and, in the quiet evenings, had begun to shape it. First, a roughly formed bird, smoother and less worn than Tom's. Then, a small, sturdy horse for Sam. Lily, he decided, would get a flower, something delicate from a softer wood. Lena watched him sometimes, her hands busy mending a tear in one of his old shirts, or kneading a small batch of dough for flatbreads made with the flour he'd found in one of the dead men's saddlebags. A silent offering. She had taken over the cooking, her skills improving with practice, coaxing flavor from their meager stores. The chip bowls were still used, but they seemed less forlorn now, filled with warm stew or porridge. The atmosphere in the cabin was still reserved, the word sparse, but the tension had eased, replaced by a fragile kind of peace. They moved around each other with a growing familiarity, an unspoken understanding of boundaries and needs. One afternoon, Elias returned from checking his traps, a string of plump fish in hand. Lena was outside, sitting on the step, Lily asleep in her lap, Sam playing at her feet with the wooden horse, making soft whinnying sounds. The sun was warm on her face, and for the first time, Elias saw a genuine, unguarded smile touch her lips as she watched Sam. It transformed her face, chasing away some of the shadows. He paused, the sight unexpectedly moving him. She looked up, her smile fading slightly, but not disappearing entirely. "Good catch," she said, her voice calm. He nodded, holding up the fish. Enough for a few days. He went to clean them by the creek, the place where Marcus Thorne had met his end. The memory was still sharp, but it no longer held the same icy grip. The water ran clear again. Later, as dusk settled, they sat by the fire. The twins were asleep, bundled warmly. Elias was sanding the small wooden flower, its petals delicate under his calloused fingers. Lena was stitching a patch onto Sam's tiny trousers. "Thank you," she said, her voice so low he almost didn't hear it. He looked up, surprised. She rarely spoke of that day. "Fuck everything." He didn't reply immediately, just continued his sanding, the rhythmic motion soothing. "They needed someone," he said finally, his voice gruff, echoing her own words from that first stormy night. He didn't say "I needed someone," though the thought flickered, unbidden, in the quiet corners of his mind. He held out the small wooden flower to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his, tracing the smooth, carved petals. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackling fire and the soft breathing of the children. A new family, forged in fear and violence, bound by shared survival and unspoken need, was slowly, hesitantly, taking shape within those rough-hewn walls. The long night was over. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, distant and cool, promising a clear dawn.